Welcome to Trial Site News podcast series. Today we will be discussing Alzheimer's, the scope, the challenges, and breakthroughs. And here to discuss this topic with us today is Dr. Weiner, Professor of Radiology at the School of Medicine and lead investigator for the Brain Health Registry and the principal investigator of the Alzheimer's Disease Neuroimaging Initiative, otherwise known as ADNI, which we here at Trial Site News are thrilled to see such work taking place and would like to take this moment to commend your work on. So Dr. Weiner, welcome.
Thank you. It was great to be on.
The pleasure is ours. Now, Dr. Weiner, we are honored to have a research investigator of your caliber on the show, and we understand the importance of Alzheimer's disease research. We have commented that this is a horrific disease that literally robs us of our most important thing, our memory, and a cure must be developed. So, how did you get involved with Alzheimer's research?
Well, that's a very long story, and you don't want to hear it all. But basically, I'm a physician. I was trained in nephrology, which is kidney disease, and I was running a hemodialysis unit in the 1970s. And I learned about something called nuclear magnetic resonance, or NMR. And I got interested in using NMR to study the kidney. And NMR turned out to be what we now know as MRI. So I was involved very early in the development of MRI before MRI were available to study people, and I was able to obtain one of the very early whole body MRI scanners in the mid-1980s and started using that to study all kinds of things. And then I had to do some thinking about what disease to focus on, and for a variety of reasons, I decided to focus on Alzheimer's disease.
So, being that you have such a good background here and you have a lot of knowledge on this subject, how would you describe the scope and magnitude of the Alzheimer's disease situation in the U.S. and worldwide?
Well, very briefly, Alzheimer's disease is a disorder which causes progressive memory loss and dementia. It's much more common in older people. Once people get into their 90s, almost half the population has symptomatic Alzheimer's disease. It's a genetically driven condition. If you have a family member or if you have one of the genes, you're much more likely to get it. It's very, very costly to take care of people who can't take care of themselves. And it's very rapidly growing because the population is aging and the population is otherwise healthy. We have less heart disease and less cancer. People are living longer, so they're more likely to get Alzheimer's disease. That's why we're seeing this big increase in the number of cases.
Right. Now, on that note, there's been a high failure rate for drug developers. Why have drug developers had such a difficult time, do you think, in finding treatments?
Well, first of all, I don't really see it that way. We've only started doing clinical trials on what we call disease-modifying treatments about 15 years ago, which is a very short time. Just think of how long we've been doing clinical trials on cancer or how long we've been doing clinical trials on hypertension. So it takes a while to get something to work. But here's what we do know. We know that the disease is defined by the accumulation of amyloid in the brain, the so-called amyloid plaques. And the amyloid plaques appear to cause a spread of another protein called tau, which forms the tangles. And somehow between the amyloid and the tau, that causes damage to the nerve cells, especially in the areas of memory, but other parts of the brain, leading to progressive memory loss and ultimately to dementia. We also know that the disease begins in the brain at least 15, maybe even 20 years before people begin symptomatic. So there is a very long pre-symptomatic phase, and then people start to have memory problems and progress to dementia and die, let's say, within 5 or maybe 7 or 8 years after that. So the real question is, how do you identify the disease early so you could prevent the development of symptoms? A scientist named Dale Schenk, maybe 15 or 20 years ago now, discovered that if you injected mice with amyloid protein, the mice would develop antibodies against that amyloid, and those antibodies would then clear the amyloid plaques in the mice. And that began what we now call immunotherapy, which is the main approach that has been used to treat Alzheimer's disease. Currently, the greatest interest is in the development of what are called monoclonal antibodies. These are antibodies that are essentially grown in a dish that attack the amyloid plaques and remove the amyloid plaques. Up till now, most of the trials have failed, and there have been a wide variety of reasons why they have failed. But there have been some glimmers of success, especially with the Biogen antibody, which is called aducanumab, and with the ASI BAN204 antibody. These antibodies clear the plaques, and there is some evidence that they do slow the progression of the disease. It's not completely clear that these are going to be clinically effective and would be approved by the FDA. There's a lot more work to be done. But I believe that everybody in the field believes that there's a glimmer of hope here that removing amyloid is going to slow the progression of the disease.
Which would be incredible.
Yeah.
So, what do you think of the recent approval in China of Green Valley's oligomer? Do you believe there is a solid science behind this?
I know very little about that, but I do have a friend whose name I shouldn't mention, who is extremely highly respected.
Mm-hmm.
He has looked at the data very carefully, and he says he doesn't see anything wrong with it.
Oh, wow.
But I think that almost all the investigators that I know feel that they would want to see a clinical trial go on in the United States and Europe that replicated the findings in China before they became convinced.
So let's switch gears a little bit. I want to talk about ADNI. Can you share more about the Alzheimer's Disease Neuroimaging Initiative, or ADNI? It's an impressive network for research, and I'd like to get your thoughts on it.
Well, when you recall a few minutes ago, I was talking about the early discovery of the fact that if you inject amyloid into mice, they'll develop antibodies, and those
Yes.
antibodies would clear the amyloid plaques. That created a huge industry in the pharmaceutical industry where many different companies were trying to develop different kinds of antibodies, monoclonal antibodies against amyloid. And people were starting to think about other kinds of treatments that really modified the progression of the disease itself. Up to that point, all of the clinical trials in Alzheimer's disease have been done on treatments like Aricept or memantine or rivastigmine. These are drugs which don't slow the progression of the disease, but they do improve some of the memory function, some of the thinking, and give people a little bit of a boost. So those drugs had been approved by the regulators, and a lot of clinical trials in the beginning of the 80s and then in the 90s were done in that area. And they were relatively short clinical trials, usually 3 months, to see whether or not those treatments improved memory function. But there was a general belief that those drugs, which improve memory function, don't really slow the course of the disease. That is, they don't prevent the ongoing neuronal destruction, which leads to dementia. And the interest shifted to treatments which removed amyloid, or treatments against tau, or other kinds of treatments which would directly affect the pathology. So then the question was, well, how do we measure the pathology in the brain? Because we can't do biopsies of the brain, for example, like you can for like cancer.
Right.
So how do we use what we call biomarkers in clinical trials for Alzheimer's disease? At that time, the main biomarkers that people were thinking about were MRI and, to some extent, PET scans. So we got the idea that we should try to put together a network of clinical sites and experts to enroll people in a study in which there was no treatment, but that we would just simply observe people with Alzheimer's disease, observe people with mild cognitive impairment, and also normal people, and follow them longitudinally over time and do MRI scans and PET scans and get blood tests and measure genetics and do all the clinical evaluations that are done in a standard clinical trial. So the ADNI was essentially designed to replicate or to mimic a clinical treatment trial, except there's no treatment. The pharmaceutical industry was extremely enthusiastic about this, as well as the NIH, because everybody who wanted to design treatment trials, clinical trials against Alzheimer's disease, wanted to understand what would be the best way to design it. Should you do MRI? Should you do PET? How often should you see people? What kinds of tests should be done, and so forth. We were in completely new ground. This was around 2001, 2002 when we first started doing this. And much to my surprise and delight, there was just a lot of interest in this. And together with my friend Leon Thal, who was the chairman of neuroscience, at the University of California, San Diego. Together, we put together a team of experts, some of the best people in the field, and we wrote a grant called the Alzheimer's Disease Neuroimaging Initiative, which was initially funded for $60 million. That we call that ADNI-1. That was funded in 2004. It ran until 2010. And then we received a series of other grants. Currently, we are in what's called ADNI-3. And overall, we've received more than $200 million from the NIH, which makes us probably the largest, biggest funded study on Alzheimer's disease, certainly using biomarkers. So we've learned a lot from that, and people have used our data to help design their clinical trials. And that's basically what ADNI is all about.
Which is incredible, and we commend that work. It's amazing what's being done there. So, Dr. Weiner, you're the lead investigator for the Brain Health Registry. Could you tell us more about that?
Well, as I mentioned, the Alzheimer's Disease Neuroimaging Initiative is a $200 million project funded by the National Institute of Aging to study Alzheimer's disease. So it's a very expensive kind of a project. And we've had difficulty getting people enrolled in this expensive Alzheimer's research. So this led to the idea, why not try to develop a website where people could go in the privacy of their own home and get involved a little bit in Alzheimer's research and help out by joining a website project. So we started up the Brain Health Registry 5 years ago. It's called brainhealthregistry.org. And it's very simple. You go to the website, and the first thing you're going to do is give your email, and then you're going to read a consent form that describes what the project is, which is very simple. And after you sign the consent form, there's a series of questions that you're asked. And the questions are going to be familiar. How old are you? What's your gender? Do you have a family history of Alzheimer's? Are you having a memory problem? What medications are you taking? Overall questions about your health, questions about how you're thinking. And then in addition to the questions, we have other questionnaires that you can answer if you wish. Questions about your diet, questions about your sleep habits, whether you've got depression or anxiety. And then we have what we call online neuropsychological tests. These are essentially memory tests. And they're a bit like a game where you're asked to see something and then you have to click on the computer whether you've seen it again or something like that. Some of the tests test your reaction time. And basically, the purpose of these tests is just to see how well your brain is functioning. And then we invite you to come back every 6 months and answer some more questions and retake the tests again. And then if there's a study that's going on, especially in your area, we might send you an email and say, Dr. So-and-so who lives near you, who's got a study going on, is looking for participants. Would you be interested in joining the study? You can click here and learn more about it. And some of the studies we're doing are online studies where we ask people to do things in addition online. For example, recently we launched a study about hoarders, people who hoard, who hold on to their newspapers and so forth. Mm-hmm. We have a number of people in the Brain Health Registry who are hoarders. And we have another study going on where we're asking people to go to a local Quest center and get some blood tests to see whether or not the amyloid in their blood shows that they have Alzheimer's disease. So we have over 70,000 people in the Brain Health Registry. It's been very successful. And if you're interested, go to brainhealthregistry.org and take a look.
And it's brainhealthregistry.org.
Exactly.
So shifting now to Alzheimer's trials, what challenges do you see in recruiting participants?
Well, the first problem is that a lot of people just see Alzheimer's disease as something that's associated with old age. It's not, they don't even think of it as a disease, and they don't think there's anything that can be done about it. So there's some apathy about the whole process. The second problem is that in the clinical trials that we do run, we are predominantly getting Caucasians who are well educated into these studies. These tend to be people who are knowledgeable about the medical care system. They're seeking out neurologists or psychiatrists or specialists in Alzheimer's disease. They're going to specialty clinics at academic medical centers, and then they get involved in clinical trials. The people who are enrolled in the clinical trials really don't look like America in general. That is, they're more predominantly white. They've got many of these trials, the average education is 2 or 3 years of college. And the trials exclude people with any comorbidity. That is, any other disease that's thought to affect the brain is excluded, and there's a good reason for that. Furthermore, people who are MRI unsafe because they've got metal in the body, such as stents and so forth, many of them are excluded. So you end up getting a population of people in the trials, which is only kind of a fraction of the total older population. And the trials themselves are just like acne. It involves MRI scanning and PET scanning and visits to doctors, and not everybody's got the time or the energy to participate in this kind of thing. I myself am a volunteer in the Alzheimer's Disease Neuroimaging Initiative. I do all the tests. I've had lumbar punctures, blood tests, MRI scans, PET scans, and it does take time, and you have to have some dedication to do it. But it's critical that people get involved in clinical trials because it's the only way that we're going to develop treatments that are effective in slowing Alzheimer's.
Agreed. Now, there are groups such as the Alzheimer's Association and others evangelizing for research. What else can be done to raise the awareness of the importance of Alzheimer's research to get more people involved?
Well, I think the people who are listening to this podcast are now getting more educated. They're talking to their friends and family. And especially if you have a relative or a friend or somebody who's, let's say, over the age of 60 and who might be starting to show some signs of memory problems or some kind of change, they might want to seek out some expert advice and potentially get enrolled in a clinical trial. There are also now a number of prevention trials that are ongoing. Prevention trials, by definition, are to prevent the development of symptoms. Right. So the people who are enrolled in the prevention trials are usually over the age of 55, and they are people who are asymptomatic, people who don't have any kind of a problem. They haven't been diagnosed with mild cognitive impairment or Alzheimer's disease, but they may be people at risk. For example, if you had a parent who had Alzheimer's or had dementia, that probably means that you are at greater risk, and you might be interested in participating in a prevention trial. For a number of reasons, it might be helpful to you, but even more important, ultimately, what everybody wants is to find a way to prevent Alzheimer's disease, just the way we prevent infectious diseases with vaccines, and we prevent heart attacks by treating high blood pressure and lowering cholesterol. We prevent strokes by lowering blood pressure and lowering cholesterol. So there's a lot of prevention that we do, and we want to find a way to prevent Alzheimer's disease. So that's a very important long-term goal.
Absolutely. So on the current drugs in the pipeline, do you believe any of them show particularly strong promise?
Well, as I mentioned, there are several. Certainly the Biogen aducanumab has announced their trial results. That's a particularly interesting situation because initially they announced that their phase 3 trials had failed, and they discontinued the trial towards the end of the trial because of futility. And then when they reanalyzed the data, it looks like the high dose of aducanumab does seem to have an effect and cause slowing of the rate of progression. Biogen has indicated that they are presenting to the FDA and going to try to get their treatment approved, which means that if it were approved, it would become available in the marketplace for physicians to prescribe. But it's unclear whether or not that's going to be approved. There's some controversy about what their findings are. Eisai has BAN204, which looked good in its phase 1 adaptive design, but they are now launched big phase 3 trials, and it'll take us time to see that. And then there are lots of other treatments in the pipeline by all the major companies, Roche, Lilly. There's lots of different AbbVie. Many different companies have different treatments in the pipeline, and There are all lots of reasons why they are in the pipeline. There's compelling animal data. There's early human data that suggests that they have some effects. So we'll just have to see. Clinical trials take time. And I think that maybe people, maybe what happened with the HIV/AIDS epidemic got people to be a little over-optimistic. In the case of HIV/AIDS, we had a virus, and the virus was emerged in the 1980s. And once the virus was discovered and they figured out what the virus was, they could develop an antiviral drug because there was already precedence for other drugs which were antiviral agents. And there was a big investment of money, and clinical trials were initiated quite soon. The disease was quite rapid in its progression, which made it easier to detect an effect. Because people, once they were diagnosed with AIDS, often they were dying within a few years. Alzheimer's disease is a very, there we saw, it was really a miracle. And it just shows you how it all works and how great it can be. And right now, very few people are dying of HIV/AIDS. And a lot of people, essentially, there's no detectable viral load. But Alzheimer's disease is a very, very different kind of situation. First of all, it's a much older population. It's a much more slowly progressive disease, and it's not an infectious agent, which can be treated with a drug which is similar to other existing drugs. It's a whole new category of diseases we call neurodegenerative diseases. Alzheimer's is the most prominent, the most common, but other disorders like Parkinson's disease, frontotemporal dementia, Lewy body dementia, these are all diseases that cause effects on the brain and are most likely seem to be caused by the accumulation of misfolded proteins. And we've only recently figured out ways to detect these misfolded proteins in the brain by using PET scans or other techniques. Blood tests are just being developed. So it's a whole new ball game, and it just takes longer to figure out how to effectively treat these diseases. So it's not something that happens in months or even years. And some people are discouraged. They say, we've had so many failures, why can't the things get hurried up? But if you look at how long it took to develop treatments for hypertension, or how long it took, look at the cancers. There's still many cancers that we have no treatments for.
Yeah.
So I think that Alzheimer's, what's going on with Alzheimer's is just kind of what would expect. So.
Well, thank you for that. Now, any final thoughts for our audience before we let you go today?
Well, I think we have a very big problem with the disease that's affecting our families, and ultimately everybody who's listening to this podcast is going to be at risk for developing Alzheimer's disease, especially once they get into their 80s and 90s. So we've got a huge problem. Fortunately, the National Institute of Aging has been getting lots of funds from Congress, so lots of research is now being done. There was some discouragement for a while on the part of some of the investment in developing treatments, but I think some of the recent findings suggest that removing amyloid plaques, or perhaps removing the oligomers that are associated with the plaques, slows the progression of the disease. And I think there's now renewed enthusiasm for pursuing treatments which remove amyloid, potentially which remove tau. And over the next year or two, we're gonna see what happens. But I'm basically in the long term, I'm very optimistic that something is going to be worked out to find a treatment to slow the progression and ultimately prevent Alzheimer's.
Thank you so much for joining us today, Dr. Weiner. We really appreciate your time.
My pleasure.
Now, for those of you looking to learn more about Dr. Weiner and his work, you can go to brainhealthregistry.org, and you can also find Trial Site News on Instagram, Twitter, and YouTube, and the links will be provided in the description below.